So I wanted to start by asking Randy a question about your work. In your work, you focus a lot on inadequate sample sizes and existing federal data, as well as some of the difficulties existing surveys have in capturing outcomes of systemic racism. So could you talk a little bit about why it's important to disaggregate economic outcomes and some of the challenges that you faced in doing that work?
Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me, and thanks to all the organizers of this. I think a lot of what was just spoken in the last session resonates with my feelings and my experience in being a researcher, trying to get data on small groups. I do a lot of work on American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, but also, as you heard two of the previous panelists speak, disaggregating some of our monolithic race and ethnic groups are also necessary because Asians have variation, Hispanics have variation, even Black as a race group in the US has lots of variation there, whether it's newly arrived immigrants from the Caribbean or from the African continent, or descendants of slavery, in the US. So there's tons of variation that we lump together. And in terms of understanding outcomes, when we rely on those really big, relatively really big groupings, we're just getting the average effect. And we're really not understanding the nuances. And I think it was Rhonda Sharp who said, it's at the intersection. That's where the rubber meets the road in some sense, where some of the really interesting, either beneficial or negative policy outcomes are realized, right? So we've experienced some of that through the pandemic. We know that, it's not all Hispanics who are adversely affected over the pandemic, but it was certain Hispanic, subpopulations that are in certain industries, at certain occupations. Same goes for all these other groups as well. But, sort of understanding that we have to be able to measure that. And we have to be able to see that in existing data.
That's really true. And I wanted to get at, follow up a little bit and ask you to dig in a little bit to, administrative data sets can be huge. And so to what extent will really, big data sets help solve some of these problems with disaggregation? And I think what the point that struck me from the previous conversation among many is really, Tracy's comment about inequality hiding in plain sight, right? Like, how do we start to get at that inequality that's really hiding in plain sight?
Yeah, so one of the benefits of administrative data, and I've been one of the beneficiaries of being able to use administrative data linked, behind firewalls in confidential use settings, where I've also, just like Danny Yegan, has also sort of used this type of data to conduct my own research. And it's particularly useful for, again, looking at small populations, because you might have the universe of tax filers, you might have the universe of respondents to the census, for instance. And that really makes it plausible and empirically viable to run statistical analyses where it's not really plausible or realistic, feasible, I guess, in other settings. And so that's where administrative data is quite useful. And especially if we're able to link across these different data sets. You heard earlier about sort of the inability to look at income tax returns because we don't have race data. Well, the Census Bureau has been able to do some linkages under agreement with the IRS to do exactly that. And I actually have been able to, with colleagues at the Census Bureau, to look at income inequality and income immobility as well, sort of the ability to see how the same person moves over time by race and ethnic group. And those kinds of data sets otherwise might exist in longitudinal sort of national surveys that we have, but only for the really big groups. So if you want to look at these smaller populations, however you define smaller population, that's not really going to be possible. So I think the possibility of using administrative data in those ways are going to open up a new world for us. But having said that, I am a big advocate in this idea of democratizing the access to these data sets. They shouldn't just be available for the elite, because there are a lot of researchers at a lot of institutions and in a lot of communities and think tanks that should also be able to, through appropriate channels, but still have access.